November 16th, 1951. Morning fog peels itself off Portsmouth Harbor, revealing the gray hull of HMS, illustrious riding at anchor, like a tired heavyweight. Along the gangway, Captain Dennis Campbell climbs slowly toward the island, gloved hand on the rail, cap pulled low against the damp chill. Under his arm is a battered briefcase. Inside it, just one sheet of paper. On that page is a sketch so simple a child could have drawn it. The outline of a carrier's flight deck, but with the landing area canted a few degrees, 8, maybe 10 to port. No complicated equations, no then-see engineering notes. Just a straight deck, bent. Nothing about it looks revolutionary. Campbell himself is not even sure it is revolutionary. He only knows that the way things are going, something has to change. What he does not know is that within 18 months, this crude little drawing will save more naval aviators' lives than any weapon system ever devised. And that before it does, the idea will be laughed at, condemned as illegal, branded impossible, by the very people whose careers are built on solving impossible problems. For the moment, Campbell is focused on one terrifying reality: the numbers. In the 12 months leading up to this walk up the gangway, the Royal Navy has lost 43 aircraft to carrier landing accidents alone. 43 machines smashed, burned, or shoved over the side. 17 pilots killed outright. Dozens more burned, broken, or maimed. Every one of those losses happened in the final 30 seconds of flight, the narrow slice of time between on approach and safe on deck, where there is no room for mistakes and no margin for mercy. Picture it: a 30-ton jet hurtling in at around 140 miles per hour, trying to snag a steel cable stretched across a pitching deck that is no wider than a city street. 60 feet ahead of that last arresting wire, a crash barricade of steel webbing stands ready to catch anything that misses. Beyond that are rows of parked aircraft, fuel, ordnance, everything needed to turn a warship into a floating airfield, and, in an instant, into a firestorm. Miss the wires on a straight deck, and there are only two outcomes. You plow into the barricade at full power, or you smash into the aircraft parked forward and take a dozen men with you when everything explodes. And this is not just a British nightmare. Cross the Atlantic, the US Navy's figures are even worse. In 1951, alone, American carrier aviation suffers 776 Class A mishaps, accidents that end in death, destroyed aircraft, or both. That is more than 2 catastrophic incidents per day. During peacetime, the Korean War only adds fuel to the fire. U.S. Boxer lugs, 7 barrier crashes in a single deployment. USS Princeton loses 9 aircraft in 4 weeks. The jet age has arrived, but carrier aviation is dying under it. The problem is cruelly simple. Jets like the F-9F Panther land 40 knots faster than prop-driven fighters like the Hellcat, and their engines take an eternity 7 full seconds to spool from idle to full power. Landing signal officers stand on the port quarter, waving paddles in frantic arcs, desperately trying to guide pilots down the glide path. But by the time a pilot realizes he is too low, too fast, or too high, the physics are already locked in. At those speeds, over that tiny impact zone, fate is decided in less time than it takes to shout a warning. Every admiral, every engineer, every test pilot knows the same grim truth. Carrier aviation has reached its breaking point. Jets are the future, but the future does not matter when the present is killing your people. And as Campbell steps onto the deck of Illustrious clutching that absurdly simple sketch, he has no way of knowing that the line he drew on paper will start a war of ideas, one that will decide who lives, who dies, and whether carriers themselves have any future at all. The crisis did not suddenly appear in 1951. It had been quietly building ever since 1945, when the jet age first brushed the deck of a carrier and everyone chose to treat the warning like a triumph. That year, Lieutenant Commander William P. Bilron brought his FR-1 Fireball in toward USS Wake Island. It was a hybrid fighter piston engine up front, jet in the fuselage, but what mattered was the speed. He crossed the ramp at about 90 knots, 20 knots faster than any piston fighter had ever done on a carrier. The arresting cables screamed under the load. The aircraft lurched. The system just barely coped. The landing was logged as successful. What it should have been logged as was first alarm bell. Nobody listened. By 1950, every major navy was flying jets from carriers, and every navy was discovering the same trap. Propeller aircraft behaved like obedient servants in the landing pattern. When the landing signal officer gave the cut signal, the pilot chopped the throttle, and the draggy airframe essentially fell onto the deck. If something went wrong, throttle response was almost instant. A last-second burst of power could haul a piston fighter back into the air. Jets were different. Jet engines were powerful but lazy. They took seconds to respond. If a pilot reduced power on final and then suddenly needed it back, he might as well pray to gravity. So jets had to land power on, carrying thrust all the way to touchdown, because if they missed the wires and needed to go around, they would need every bit of spool-up time they could steal. Now, combine that with the unforgiving geometry of a straight-deck carrier. 4 arresting wires stretched across about 60 feet of deck. Immediately ahead of them, the crash barricade, a steel web meant to save aircraft that missed. And beyond that, parked aircraft, fueling rigs, ammunition carts, the working heart of the flight deck. A Panther coming aboard at 125 knots is covering roughly 211 feet every second. Miss all 4 wires, and you have about 2.1 seconds before you hit the barricade. If that barricade fails, you and 30 tons of metal, fuel, and explosives plow into whatever and whoever is waiting forward. In March 1951, on USS Kearsarge, Captain Bruce Williams watched that nightmare unfold. A jet hit the barrier at full power. The report was clinical. Aircraft struck barrier at full power. Barrier separated. Aircraft continued forward into 6 parked Corsairs. Resulting fire reached Aviation gasoline stores. 14 aircraft destroyed. 11 personnel killed. 23 injured. Carrier operation suspended 48 hours. Beneath the language of procedure was the reality. 11 men died because 60 feet was not enough forgiveness. The responses all attacked the symptom, never the cause. The British built the flex deck, a rubberized landing surface meant to absorb jets without landing gear. Test pilot Lieutenant Commander Eric Brown made 40 landings on it. In his official report, he called it fundamentally sound. To his friends, he called it bloody terrifying. The Americans poured millions into ever stronger barriers. The Davis barrier system could stop a 25,000-pound aircraft at full power when it worked. When it did not, the devastation was total. Stronger nets, smarter nets, backup nets. None of it changed the fact that pilots were still driving headlong into a wall. Behind closed doors, the more honest officers admitted the real problem was not the nets at all. It was the flight deck itself. Captain William T. Razier put it in writing in June 1945. Current landing procedures force all aircraft into a 60-foot impact zone with zero margin for error. This is incompatible with jet aircraft performance characteristics. Translation: we designed our carriers for 70-knot prop planes that could abort at the last second. Now, we are trying to land 130-knot jets that can abort on the same postage stamp of steel. People will die until we fix this. Everyone agreed there was a problem. No one had a solution. And then came Dennis Campbell, a man nobody expected to solve anything. Born in Southsea in 1907, he joined the Royal Navy in 1925, learned to fly in canvas and wire biplanes, and spent the war flying obsolete Swordfish, torpedo bombers, against ships like the Bismarck. Competent, brave, decorated, but no one called him a visionary. After the war, he was parked in a desk job at the Ministry of Supply, shuffling paper between the Navy and civilian contractors. What changed him was not a memo. It was a funeral. Lieutenant Michael Mick Lithgow, a young test pilot Campbell had once trained, died when his jet hit the barricade on HMS Implacable. Perfect approach. Correct speed. 6 feet long. Missed the wires. The barrier failed. His aircraft disintegrated. His widow was 5 months pregnant. At the graveside, Campbell muttered to his deputy, "Nick Goodhart, this is insane. We are murdering them with our own equipment. A pilot does everything right and still dies. Because 60 feet is not enough. There has to be another way." Most officers leave those words in the cemetery. Campbell did not. He pulled accident reports. He interviewed landing signal officers. He filled notebooks with crude drawings. On a train ride from Portsmouth to London, staring at yet another sketch of a straight deck he could not lengthen, he turned the landing area slightly to port. If you can't make the landing area longer, change the direction it points. Angle it. And suddenly, a bolter does not end in steel and fire. It ends in open sea and a second chance. On paper, the idea looked almost childish. In practice, it would be branded criminal. August 7th, 1951. Ministry of Supply, London. A windowless conference room. Bad coffee. Ashtrays overflowing. Around the table sit the people who supposedly understand carrier aviation better than anyone alive. Louis Boddington, from the Naval Air Department at Farnborough. Rear Admiral M. Ease Slattery from Naval Research. A half-dozen senior aviation engineers and staff officers. At the far end, standing stiff, backed with his battered briefcase on the table, is Captain Dennis Campbell. He opens the case, pulls out his notebook, and lays a single sketch in the center of the room. "This," he says, "is what I propose." Silence. Stretches. The sketch is simple. The usual straight flight deck of a carrier. And across it, a landing area canted about 10 degrees to port, running diagonally from aft starboard to forward port, terminating not in a barricade, but an empty ocean. The first reaction is not curiosity. It is outrage. That, one commander snaps, stabbing a finger at the drawing, is completely illegal. The words hit the table with the weight of a court-martial. Commander James, Senior Flight Operations Specialist, does not need to raise his voice. The International Air Navigation Convention requires all flight operations to align with the vessel's axis, he says. What you are proposing violates a maritime aviation standard written after 15 years of carrier operations. This is not innovation. Captain, it is amateur nonsense. Campbell had expected resistance. He had not expected to be treated like a crank. The objections come fast now. A carrier pitches and rolls around its keel. They remind him, with a straight deck, the pilot's approach aligns with the ship's motion. Angle the deck, and you are forcing pilots to land across that motion, fighting drift all the way in. The landing area will be sliding sideways under them while they are trying to judge vertical, sink, horizontal speed, and lineup. You will increase crashes, not reduce them. Someone says, "You are asking us to make an already impossible job harder." Campbell starts to answer, but before he can, the quietest man in the room moves. Louis Boddington, the civilian engineer with ink-stained fingers, raises a hand. "Show me the math," he says. The room goes still. "I beg your pardon." Commander James frowns. "The math." Boddington repeats calmly. "You say pilots will fight, drift. Fine. Calculate it. Assume an 8-degree angled deck on a ship rolling 12 degrees. Show us the differential drift over a 30-second approach. How much more lateral correction is required compared to an axial deck?" Silence. Eyes shift. Papers shuffle. No one speaks. Because for all the confident pronouncements, no one has actually run the numbers. Boddington leans back. "If nobody can calculate the effect, then we do not know it is dangerous. We are just afraid of it. So we test it." He turns to Campbell. "Captain, at Farnborough, we have got an outline runway painted on the ground for approach simulations. We can do the same at sea. Paint an angled deck outline on HMS Triumph's flight deck. Purely cosmetic. For a few weeks, We fly simulated approaches. Touch and goes. No structural changes. No aircraft committed to full-stop landings. If this drift problem is real, we will see it in the data. If it is not, we will know that too. Rear Admiral Slattery fixes him with a cold stare. Lewis, you understand that if we paint an angled deck on Triumph and pilots start crashing, you will end your career and Captain Campbell's with a pot of white paint. Noted, sir. Boddington says. Then he allows himself the smallest of smiles. And if it works, we stop killing pilots who did everything right. A month later, HMS Triumph steams out with a ghost deck, the traditional straight landing area, and across it, in crisp white paint, a diagonal outline at 8 degrees to port. For 3 weeks, Navy pilots fly endless approaches, treating that painted line as the real edge of the world. They are told to fly, as if the angled landing area is all they have. Miss the imaginary wires, and they go around. The predicted disaster never materializes. There is no mysterious, sideways slide, yanking jets off the deck. Pilots report that adapting to the new lineup takes 1, maybe 2 passes. After that, their brains file it under just another deck. What does change is something the engineers had not measured. Fear. Lieutenant Peter Chilton, one of the test pilots, later writes, I came in too high, floated past the wires, and for the first time in my career, I was not terrified. I just poured on power and climbed away. No barrier waiting to kill me. No aircraft ahead. Just clean air. And a second chance. I felt like I would been given my life back. By October 1951, the painted deck trials have shown what Campbell suspected on that train. The geometry works. The supposed law of straight decks turns out not to be physics at all, just habit dressed up as doctrine. But if convincing a handful of British engineers took white paint and 3 weeks at sea, convincing the most powerful navy on Earth, the one losing pilots even faster, will take something much riskier. September 14th, 1951. Patuxent River Naval Air Test Center, Maryland. The humidity presses down like a wet blanket, and 40 American test pilots sit shoulder to shoulder in a briefing room that smells of coffee, sweat, and jet fuel. On the wall hangs a familiar silhouette, a straight-deck carrier, the kind they have been gambling their lives on for years. At the front of the room stands a compact man in Royal Navy blue, Lieutenant Commander Eric Winkle Brown, Britain's chief test pilot, the man who has landed more different aircraft types on carriers than anyone in history. Records, medals, world firsts, none of that matters right now. All that matters is whether this roomful of Americans is willing to listen to a foreigner tell them that their carriers are built wrong. Gentlemen, Brown begins, his accent crisp. Before we start, I would like a show of hands. He scans the rows. In the past 12 months, how many of you have hit the barricade? For a heartbeat, no one moves. Then a hand goes up in the back. Then another. Then 5 more. Within seconds, a third of the room has an arm raised. Brown nods. Face unreadable. How many of you know someone who died hitting the barricade? This time, there is no hesitation. Every hand goes up. The silence that follows is thick. The statistics Campbell carried up the gangway in Portsmouth are alive. Here in this room, woven into scars and funerals, and the way pilots pause half a second before writing letters home. Brown sets his briefcase on the table and opens it. I am going to show you something the Royal Navy has been testing. He says, it is going to sound insane, but I have made dozens of landings on it, and I am standing here instead of being scraped off a flight deck. So I am asking you, for the sake of the men you just raised your hands for, to hear me out. He pins Campbell's diagram to the board. An aircraft carrier flight deck angled 8 degrees to port. For a moment, the room is utterly still. Then the explosion comes. You want us to land sideways? Someone barks. The LSO won't be able to judge. Line up. You are moving the landing zone toward the island. What happens when a guy drifts right into the superstructure? Carrier doctrine demands axial approaches. This violates everything we have learned since 1942. Brown lets the noise crest and fade. He has heard every objection already in British accents. Every point you just shouted, he says quietly. We raised too. Then we painted the deck on HMS Triumph and tested it. Here's what we found. When you miss the wires on an angled deck, you do not die. You pour on power and go around. That is it. No barricade waiting to tear you apart. No parked aircraft sitting in your path. Just another try. Commander Harold Buell, Co. of VF-84, stands up. He has the hard look of a man who has been landing on carriers since before some of the younger pilots could shave. Commander Brown, he says, I have been bringing aircraft aboard since 1943. What you are describing cuts against 8 years of combat-proven doctrine. You are asking us to throw that away on the basis of British theory and some painted lines. I am not asking you to throw away doctrine, Brown replies. I am asking you to stop dying for a design flaw. The words hang there, dangerous and true. You are landing jets on straight decks for one reason, Brown continues. That is what you have got. But those decks were built for Corsairs and Hellcats that could chop, throttle, and drop onto the wire. Jets can't do that. So you are forcing 1,952 aircraft into 1,942 operations. And your people are paying the difference with their lives. The angled deck does not throw doctrine away. It updates the ship to match the airplane. At the back of the room, Rear Admiral Apollo Soucek, senior U.S. Naval aviator in London, invited observer of the Triumph trials, steps forward. I have seen the British tests, he says. The concept works. I have recommended to the Chief of Naval Operations that we run parallel trials on USS Midway. Paint only. No structural changes. Data first, decisions after. Before anyone can react, another figure rises. Rear Admiral Alfred Pride, head of the Bureau of Aeronautics. His word carries weight. He is the man behind the Davis Barrier, the giant mechanical web the Navy has spent $3.2 million perfecting. We are already testing solutions, Pride says coolly. The Davis Barrier has a 98.7% success rate. Of what? Brown cuts in. Of aircraft that hit it. Pride's jaw tightens. What about the pilots who never reach your barrier? Brown presses. The ones who see it coming at 130 knots and choose to ditch in the ocean rather than gamble on hitting it at full power. Your statistic measures barrier performance. It does not measure the pilots who are terrified of the thing designed to save them. Noise erupts again. Some pilots nodding, some bristling, some torn in the middle. These men have watched friends walk away from barriers, and they have watched others never climb out. Soucek raises his voice. Gentlemen, enough. The room stills. We will test the angled deck on Midway, he says. Paint trials only. Simulated landings. If it works, we will structurally modify one carrier for full implementation. If it fails, the idea dies here. But we will not continue losing pilots to a design we are too proud to test. Are we clear? All eyes swing to Pride. For 10 long seconds, he says nothing. Then, finally, Midway trials authorized. But if this British pipe dream causes a single additional casualty, I will terminate the program and every career tied to it. Soucek nods once. Agreed. The meeting breaks. Pilots file out, murmuring, arguing, weighing fear of change against fear of another funeral. Brown closes his briefcase around Campbell's sketch, knowing he has just bet his reputation on a painted line. What he does not know is that within 90 days, that painted line on Midway will work so well that the U.S. Navy will convert USS Antietam into the first true angled deck carrier in the world, and that on a gray morning off Cuba, one nervous pilot will discover what it means to land on a deck that finally wants him to live. January 12th, 1953. Off the coast of Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, the sea lies in long, lazy swells. Overhead, the pattern is busy. Jets arcing down toward a ship that looks familiar from a distance and utterly alien up close. USS Antietam is no longer a straight-deck carrier. Welded to her port side is an 8-degree sponson, a structural extension that turns theory and paint into steel. This is the first true angled deck carrier in the world. No more ghost lines in white. This is real. Cables, crash markings, deck edge, all turned slightly to port. A geometric insult to 50 years of tradition. Lieutenant Commander Harold Buell pulls his F-9, F-5 Panther into the break, heart rate spiking in spite of himself. This is his 43rd carrier landing. He has seen combat. He has ridden straight decks through bad weather, and worse, luck. But this is the first time his life literally depends on a drawing dreamed up in a British bureaucrat's notebook. He runs through the brief in his head. Land, as if it is a normal deck. Fly the ball. If you miss the wires, do not panic. Do not snatch at the controls. Just add power and climb. The deck is clear forward. No barricade. No parked aircraft. Trust the angle. That is the hard part. Because for his entire career, survival has meant one thing: hit the wires or face the barrier. That fear has saved him more than once. Now, they are telling him to forget it. Buell drops his landing gear, sets flaps, trims out, and calls the ball. Panther ball. 3.2. Roger ball. The landing signal officer replies, "So far, everything feels normal. Meatball, lineup, angle of attack, the deck rising and falling beneath him in that familiar stomach-tightening rhythm. His approach is perfect until it is not. A gust lifts his aircraft 6 feet. Suddenly he is high. On a straight deck. This is where the LSO would give a frantic wave off. Buell would push power, stagger back into the sky, burn fuel, and try again, his nerves fraying with each pass. Today, the LSO says nothing. On an angled deck, being a little high is not a catastrophe. It is a correction. Buell shoves the nose down, bleeds off the excess altitude. But now he is long. He knows it even before his wheels hit. He slams onto the deck, bounces, the tailhook skipping like a stone. 1 wire missed, 2 wire missed, 3 wire missed, 4 wire missed. He has boltered, missed every single cable. On a straight deck, the next thing would be the shriek of the barrier as it tried to tear his aircraft apart or failed, and hurled him into a neat row of parked jets and fuel hoses. Instead, there is nothing in front of him but painted lines and open sky. Buell rams the throttle forward. The J-48 engine spools up 6 long seconds, an eternity that for once feels generous. The Panther accelerates down the angled strip and lifts off into clean air. No smashing impact. No erupting fireball. Just another circuit in the pattern. 20-odd seconds later, he is lined up again. This time, muscle memory has begun to trust the briefing. He rides the ball, ignores the ghost of the barricade that is not there, and plants the Panther with a solid thump, the tailhook biting the 3-wire. Full stop. When he climbs out, his hands are shaking. Not from fear. From the sudden absence of a fear he had not realized had lived in his spine for a decade. He will later write, "To an experienced tailhooker, landing a jet airplane on an angled deck was sheer bliss. For the first time in my career, I was not afraid of dying during every approach. The psychological weight that lifted off me that day I did not know I would been carrying it until it was gone. Over the next 60 days, Antietam's angled deck is worked hard. Carrier Air Group 8 racks up 1,327 landings. There are 8 bolters. 8 times pilots miss all 4 wires and have to go around. On a straight deck, that might have meant 5 barrier crashes, 2 aircraft destroyed, 1 or 2 pilots killed, dozens of deck crew risking their lives amid wreckage and fire. On Antietam's angled deck, the numbers are brutally simple. 8 bolters, 0 crashes, 0 destroyed aircraft, 0 injuries. Across the fleet, the broader picture begins to shift. Before the angled deck, 1,950 to 1,952, the U.S. Navy averages 647 Class A mishaps per year. In carrier aviation, more than half of all aircraft losses come from landing accidents alone. After angled deck implementation, from 1,955 to 1,957, that annual average drops to 321. Landing accidents fall to 19% of losses. The net reduction, roughly 75% fewer landing accidents. Barrier-related fatalities, down by about 80%. But statistics are cold. The human reality comes into focus on March 8th, 1953. Lieutenant James Davidson brings a damaged Panther back to Antietam. Hydraulic failure. No flaps. His landing speed is 20 knots too high. On a straight deck, he would not even try to come aboard. He would ditch in the ocean rather than gamble on hitting a barrier at 145 knots. On an angled deck, he has another option. Davidson makes one approach, misses the wires, goes around. Second approach, misses again. Third, same result. On a straight deck, his fuel and his nerve would already be gone. On the 4th try, he roars across the ramp, doing 142 knots, fastest carrier landing attempted to that point, and his tailhook finally tears into the 4-wire. The aircraft screeches to a halt, with 11 feet of deck remaining. 6 months later, a letter arrives for Dennis Campbell. Davidson writes, "Sir, I never met you, but I am alive to write this letter because you had an idea everyone said was impossible. My daughter was born last month. I got to be there, because you refuse to accept that good pilots should die for bad design." Thank you does not cover it, but thank you. It is one voice, from one pilot, on one ship. But by now, the angled deck is spreading first across the Royal Navy, then across Allied fleets, and even, grudgingly, to America's rivals. The sketch from Portsmouth is becoming the new shape of the sea. By the mid-1952s, the angled deck stopped being a British experiment and started becoming the new face of naval power. In 1955, HMS Ark Royal slid down the ways, the first carrier in the world designed from the keel up with an angled deck, not just painted lines or welded sponsons. The landing area was part of her bones. At the commissioning ceremonies, reporters clustered around Rear Admiral Dennis Campbell, holding out notebooks and microphones, eager to hear from the man who changed carrier aviation. He deflected every question. Talked to Boddington and the engineers at Farnborough. He told them, pointing the spotlight away from himself. They did the hard work. The man whose sketch had rewritten the geometry of every carrier in the Western world had no interest in becoming a celebrity. Across the Atlantic, the Americans moved just as quickly. USS Antietam was the first testbed, but she would not be the last. In 1955, when the U.S. Navy commissioned USS Forrestal, its first true supercarrier, she rolled out with 3 big leaps: an angled deck, steam catapults, and a modern optical landing system. Campbell was invited to the ceremony. He sent his regrets. He was attending a funeral instead. The dead man was not lost in a carrier crash. He would died in a helicopter accident. Routine training gone wrong. But he would served under Campbell in 1943. And in Campbell's world, you attended your people's funerals. Always. 2 years later, in 1957, the Admiralty awarded him the CBE Commander of the Order of the British Empire for services to naval aviation. The official citation ran to 2 dry sentences. Campbell put the medal and the paper in a drawer. No display case. No wall of honors. He retired from the Royal Navy in 1960 and moved quietly into a role as a technical consultant for Hawker Siddeley Aviation, working on the new generation of vertical takeoff jets. Colleagues remembered a man who was polite, methodical, and infuriatingly fixated on one thing. What happens to the pilot when things go wrong? Dennis would slow down every design review. Engineer Anthony Marsh recalled. He would point at some obscure component and ask, "What happens if this fails at night?" In bad weather, we would tell him the odds were 1 in 10,000. He would say, "Fine. What does the pilot do when he is the 1 in 10,000? He never cared about averages. He cared about the one unlucky man sitting in the cockpit. On April 6, 2000, at the age of 92, Dennis Campbell died. The Times ran an obituary of 4 paragraphs. The Guardian managed 6. Both mentioned the angled deck. Neither could possibly convey what it meant. Because by then, his revolution had become so universal that younger pilots did not even know there had ever been another way. By the mid-1970s, every serious carrier in the Western world had an angled deck or was being rebuilt, with one British-French Clemenceau, Australian Melbourne, all of them cutting their flight decks to match Campbell's sketch. Even the Soviets, who initially dismissed the concept, quietly adopted it after a string of catastrophic accidents aboard their straight-deck carrier Varyag. Declassified records later showed that within 6 months of conversion, their landing accident rate dropped by nearly 70%. Today, every aircraft carrier on Earth, American, British, French, Indian, Chinese, Russian, uses some form of angled deck. The US Navy's newest Gerald R. Ford-class carriers boast electromagnetic catapults and advanced arresting gear, digital flight controls, and sensor suites that would look like sorcery to a 1,950 seconds pilot. But if you stand on the fantail and look forward, one thing is exactly as Campbell drew it in 1951. The landing area still cants about 8 degrees to port, ending not in a barricade but in open ocean. Modern carrier pilots make over 15,000 landings per year across the U.S. fleet alone. The bolter rate missed. Wire approaches that require a go-around hovers around 8%. That is roughly 1,200 times a year. That, on a straight deck, someone would be staring down a barrier or a row of parked jets. Instead, they just climb away and try again. Hundreds of near misses every year that never become funerals. Stretch that over 70 years, across every navy that went to sea with jets, and you are no longer talking about a handful of lives saved. You are talking about tens of thousands. In 2003, Lieutenant-Colonel Arthur Black, US Marine Corps Ret, sat down to write a letter. He would flown FA, 18 seconds off carriers from 1,985 to 2007, racking up 147 carrier landings. He hunted down Campbell's family and wrote, "I never met your father, but I made 147 carrier landings during my career. I boltered more times than I can count, missed all the wires and had to go around. On a straight deck, every one of those might have killed me, or the men working the deck ahead. Instead, I just climbed away and tried again. Your father gave me second chances. He gave me a career. He gave me a life. On behalf of every carrier pilot who lived because of him, thank you." Campbell never answered. He would been dead 3 years. But his son framed that letter and hung it on the wall. His father had never kept his own awards. That he would have kept. And that is the real lesson, buried inside this story of steel and angles and carrier decks. Some breakthroughs do not come from the people with the biggest titles or the most degrees. They come from the one person who can't ignore the bodies piling up, who refuses to accept. That is how we have always done it, as the final word. Campbell was not a design legend or a test pilot demigod. He was a bureaucrat who went to too many funerals and finally snapped. He drew a crooked line on a piece of paper and would not shut up when everyone said it was illegal, impractical, impossible. The angled deck has saved more lives than some entire fleets of warships. It changed naval warfare more than any single gadget bolted to a hull. And yet its greatest triumph is that now it is invisible just how carriers are. Somewhere out there, the next Dennis Campbell is staring at a problem everyone else has learned to live with. No one will ask that person to change history. They will probably be told to stop making trouble. But if they keep asking why, and why not, if they refuse to let good people die for bad design, they might pick up a pen, sketch something that looks stupidly simple, and quietly save the world.